Hello and happy Friday. Thank you for joining me again for A Stitch in Crime. If you didn't join us last week, my name is Erica. I am the host. Welcome to A Stitch in Crime. This is where we sit down, get together, pull out some yarn, make something, and talk about true crime together. I'm so glad you could join me. Last week, there were issues with the audio. I apologize for that. I don't know what I'm doing. And that's okay. That can be said for a lot of things in life. If you don't know what you're doing, it's okay. We kind of just make shit up as we go along, and that's exactly what I'm doing here today. So hopefully, since I turned the microphone down, the audio will be a little better, but if you hear cars going, or someone burning out, or any automotive noises, I live on a pretty busy street, and I've got all my windows open, because for some reason, it's been in the upper 80s here in Indiana. I don't think people are supposed to live this way. You know, if it was only down to 70 at night, okay. But then it gets down to like 50 at night, so it's the time of the year where you have to have AC and heat. I really don't think that human beings are supposed to live in the Midwest. Like, I love it here, and I'm too big of a chicken shit to ever move permanently, but I don't think that people are supposed to do this with themselves. Anyway, let's get started. So we're gonna be continuing to work on our Retro Future Hair Scarf by Doe and Deer Crochet. We'll be finishing that up today. And next week, just a little preview, if you like this top, this is the My Little Secret Crop by Jessie Made Designs. It is a size inclusive, amazing pattern. It's probably my favorite pattern of all time. We'll get into that next week, but just as a sneak preview. So today's episode is going to require a little bit of a background knowledge. We're going to have to talk a little bit about the history and culture of Mormon people. I'm not going to get too into it, A, because we don't have infinite time, and B, because I won't do it justice, and it's not really my circus, but it's important to have a little bit of background knowledge in order to properly discuss who we're going to be covering today. And that would be Tom Green. No, not that Tom Green, not the Canadian Tom Green. Tom Green from the American state of Utah, a man who married a total of 9 wives throughout the course of his life. Now, in order to contextualize what Tom was doing, it's important that we talk about what fundamentalist Mormonism is. So, in the 1800s, when the Mormon faith was first conceptualized, they had the belief in plural marriage. That is the practice of polygamy, specifically polygyny, so one man and some large number of wives. This was a practice of their faith, and they took it with them as they moved from the east to Utah. Now, by the time Utah was preparing for statehood, it was heavily impressed upon the people of Utah, if you want to enter statehood and enjoy that benefit that other states do, you'll have to disavow polygamy, which the Mormon Church officially did in the late 1800s, shortly before Utah became an official state. However, some Mormons did splinter from that group and continue practicing polygamy in secrecy. So today, the mainstream Mormon Church, that's the Mormon Church that over half of people from Utah participate in, the Church of Latter-day Saints. They're the ones that go on missions. They're the ones that you might associate with coming to your house and spreading the Book of Mormon. That's mainstream Mormonism. They do not practice polygamy anymore, and they do not like being associated with fundamentalist Mormonism, who are an offshoot of mainstream Mormonism. So if you ever see those kinds of shows like Sister Wives or My 5 Wives or Escaping Polygamy, those are not members of the mainstream Mormon Church. Those are members of fundamentalist offshoots of the Mormon Church that are related to and descended of original Mormonism, but no longer have an affiliation with the mainstream Mormon Church. It's also worth noting that there are many different kinds of fundamentalist Mormon churches. There are, I believe, over a dozen fundamentalist Mormon churches in the U.S. who practice polygamy. It's not just the FLDS. Right? So the FLDS you may associate with Warren Jeffs and those terrible images from the 2000s of large groups of women and children wearing prairie dresses and their hair in these like rolls, and they're all being escorted out of these huge compounds, and they're all led by that one fucking evil guy, Warren Jeffs. That's the FLDS church. There are other kinds of polygamist Mormon churches as well. So if you've ever seen that show Sister Wives, they are affiliated with the AUB church. Different from the FLDS church. So that's just a little history that's important to note as we get into today's case. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So today we're going to be talking about a man by the name of Thomas Arthur Green and his life story as he traversed Utah, marrying and sometimes divorcing a total of 9 different wives, 6 of whom were children when he married them. So Tom Green was born on June 9th, 1948 to parents John Green and Bertha Green. He had 3 older siblings and would later have 2 younger siblings, so he was the 4th of 6. Now, John, Bertha, and the Green family were members of the mainstream Mormon church. They were not affiliated with a fundamentalist church. He was born into the LDS church, and he had a very typical Mormon childhood and lifestyle. He went to school, graduated, and then went on a mission trip, actually, to Indiana and Michigan. He came to right here in the Midwest to spread the gospel about the Book of Mormon. Very, very traditional mainstream Mormon upbringing. So far, so good, okay? Now, when Tom gets back from his mission trip, he meets a woman named Linda Penman, who is his age, early 20s, also Mormon. They're married in Salt Lake City at the LDS church, and over the next decade, they would go on together to have 3 children. Tom worked as a salesman and also worked in the dry cleaning business, and they had a really normal Mormon lifestyle together. However, Tom had been developing an interest in fundamentalist Mormonism. So Tom and Linda Penman are married, they've got 3 kids, they're being normal Mormon people. The only difference is that Tom is developing an interest in the fundamentalist Mormon practice of polygamy. He's really starting to think, I'd like to convert to one of these fundamentalist churches so that I can begin taking on plural wives. He's decided that's what would really make him happy, that's what he believes, that's what he thinks that God wants him to do, that's the direction that he's gonna go with his life. He even has some friends warning him, dude, you shouldn't do that because you will be ostracized from life as you know it currently. It's very contentious between the fundamentalist churches and mainstream Mormonism because of polygamy. Frequently, the fundamentalist churches want to be underground quiet because what they do is illegal, and mainstream Mormonism doesn't want to be associated with polygamy and with those practices. Tom's got some different ideas here. He goes ahead, he converts, and everything changes. At this point, Linda Penman does leave him, and he has to create a new life for himself, which is ostensibly pretty difficult. He's moving away from everything that he's ever known to begin practicing an underground lifestyle that is illegal in the state of Utah. But he goes and he does that anyway, and he begins marrying multiple plural wives. Now, by 1984, Tom marries his first polygamist wife, Beth Cook. Beth had children from her previous marriage to another polygamist man. Beth was actually Tom's age, thereabouts. She was a little bit older than him. She's got children from a previous relationship, including Linda, who at the time in 1984 was 12 years old. Now, Linda had always really strongly identified with her family's background in fundamentalist Mormonism and polygamy. It was something that she was passionate about even from a young age. So when Tom and Beth get married, Linda, who again is 12, starts to demonstrate an attraction towards Tom, and Tom does reciprocate. And by this point, he's even got friends of his going, she's literally a child. She's a kid. You know, she's turning 13. This is a child. And he's telling them that he wants to get married to her. To which Beth is a little bit like, I don't know. She's pretty young. Maybe this should not happen. But Tom and Linda are pretty adamant about going through with the marriage. So actually what happens next, in the beginning of 1986, so by this point, Linda is 13 and a half, thereabouts. Tom, Beth, and Linda go down to Mexico, where they learn that in Mexico, Linda is of legal age to be married. So in the beginning of 1986, Tom and Linda get married. Now by this point, Tom is 34, Linda is 13. And there in Mexico, Linda conceives her first son with Tom, Melvin, and thus begins her married life with Tom. Now, early on in Linda and Tom's marriage, Linda becomes good friends with one of her cousins by the name of Shirley. Shirley is just a little bit older than Linda. Shirley is like 15, 16 by this point. Her initial foray into the Green family is that she becomes friends with Linda, who is her cousin, because Linda's mom, Beth, and Shirley's mom, June, are sisters. Now, as Shirley continues her friendship with Linda, she and Tom actually begin courting, and they too get married not long after Linda and Tom were married. And following this, actually, June, who is Beth's sister and Shirley's mother, again, also begins courting Tom, and they too get married. So by 1990, Tom has 4 wives, in order: Beth, Linda, Shirley, and June. And they are all of biological relation to each other. Now, it's around this point that Tom actually begins to take his lifestyle and broadcast it on national television. It's as early as 1990 that we see the Green family, all 4 wives, included in a documentary about fundamentalist Mormonism.
They say they're a sisterhood which shares cooking, childcare, and work for the family. They also share Tom.
We'd rather have 25% of a 100% man than to have 100% of a 25% man.
Are these Tom 100%?
Absolutely.
All the way.
We think he is.
And as you can see by this point, Linda's better part of 17 years old, and she's already extremely vocal and open about how this is what she was prepared to do, this is the lifestyle she's wanted to live. That is going to become a recurring theme with Linda's narrative particularly. She, of all of the wives, is going to become the most vocal and adamant about how this is what she wants. This is what she is consenting to, even when she is a child and legally, ethically, morally cannot be consenting to this arrangement. Now, something else that continues here is that Tom is going to keep on broadcasting his life with his wives on television and in documentaries, not just in the US, but internationally as well. This was considered pretty controversial at the time because, like I said, this is not a legal lifestyle that these people are living. In Utah, at the time, it was illegal to cohabitate or live with more than one partner because due to their common law marriage statute, if you lived with someone and held yourself out as a spouse, that made you their spouse. So by this point in 1990, Tom is living with 4 women and holding them out as spouses. What he's doing is extremely illegal, and he's telling everybody. I mean, everybody. He was the first polygamist guy to go on TV and say, look at all of my wives. That wasn't no Cody Brown done that first. That wasn't no Brady. They were behind. When you consider that Tom Green, as early as 1990, was going on TV and saying, look, I have 4 wives and 2 of them are kids. So by 1990 now, June is thrown in the mix and she's married to Tom as his 4th wife. She, like her sister Beth, whenever Beth married Tom, brought some of her children into the household as well. And one of those was her 14-year-old daughter, Leanne. Now, Leanne would go on to travel to what's called Short Creek. That's the polygamist community at the Utah-Arizona border where these women all grew up. It's a town comprised primarily of families living in plural marriage. She goes down, Leanne does, to Short Creek to talk with her father and another one of her mothers about what's been happening in the household, namely that Tom has been molesting her sexually. They go to the police together and Leanne testifies that Tom, who again is married to her sister and her mother, is molesting her now. And Tom is charged with sexual abuse of Leanne. Now what happens later is that actually Leanne drops the charges against Tom, and by 1991, she and Tom get married as well. So we see this shift where she goes from having him charged with molesting her to actually becoming his 5th wife at the time by 1991. Also in 1991, Tom marries 2 more young girls. We have Carrie, who is at the time 15 or 16, I believe, and then Carrie's younger sister, Hannah, who is 14, just a touch younger than Leanne is. So if we're keeping track here, he's got a total of 7 wives by 1991. And he's having children, a lot of children, with all of these wives. And they are just living in domesticity at actually a trailer park outside of Salt Lake City. They have multiple mobile homes where the wives are living with the children, because you need a lot of space when you have a family of that size. It's also worth noting that in 1990, for about 6 weeks, Tom was married to a young girl who was 16 by the name of Allison Ryan. Allison would later go on to say that Tom had been very abusive and that she wanted nothing to do with the relationship. It was only a 6-week-long marriage and she got out of it very quickly. By 1991, he has 7 wives and he's living in this trailer park with them. You guys, this is so hard. Like, this is an extremely hard case to talk about, not just because the subject matter is fairly disturbing, but also just because logistically there's so much happening here. I have like 13 pages of notes, and most of it is just describing who everyone is. I mean, this guy somehow married and either stayed married to or divorced or was left by 9 women between when he was married to Linda Penman in the 70s and his polygamist wives going into the early 90s. 9 women. Logistically, this is impossible to talk about. I'm not even going to try to name and age all of the children that he's had. It's dozens of them. He's literally created a community of women and children out of this belief that he has to amass such a large family. It's absurd. It's really difficult for me to comprehend, and I come from a pretty big Filipino Catholic family myself. I don't know who all of my cousins are, honestly. These women are sometimes saying that they don't know who all of their brothers and sisters are because their fathers had so many wives and so many children. That's the magnitude of the size of a fundamentalist Mormon family. So by 1996, a couple of things happened. Number one, Beth and June actually leave the marriage for a number of reasons. Beth would later go on to say that a big reason that she left her marriage with Tom was because she needed to not have a sister-wife relationship with her daughter Linda that she wanted to go back to being mother and daughter with Linda. And I believe that the two older women alluded that there was not necessarily tension, but just that the vibe basically was different between them as older women and mothers of 3 of the younger wives and these teenagers that Tom had married. So 1996, Beth and June leave the marriage, and also the Green family is evicted from the trailer park that they were living in, ostensibly because of their polygamous lifestyle. So by this point, Tom goes and buys a platter of land in the West Utah desert, and he calls it Greenhaven. Now, Tom buys Greenhaven with no money down, site relatively unseen, just as a place where he can park all of his trailers and put them there so that his family, which by this point is dozens of people now, have a place to live. And initially, things are not smooth sailing for Tom and his now 5 wives. When they're moving their trailers out to Greenhaven, a drunk driver slams into one of them. There is a strong windstorm that damages another trailer. And actually in 1997, very tragically and unfortunately, an electrical fire burned down another one of the trailers, killing Shirley and Tom's 3-year-old son named Jerry. And in the backdrop of all of this happening, Tom is continuing to go on television with his wives and try to, as he puts it, explain about his lifestyle. I don't know if I would say that Tom is the best figurehead for his cause. He is, in addition to being a very unusual man and not necessarily culturally representative of the people that he's going and claiming to be a part of, because he was born into mainstream Mormonism and he has a lot of different ideas from them, he's also marrying children. He's not winning anyone over going on TV and saying, it's okay that I've married all of these children. It's fine. So in 1996, he actually went on Springer, famously, and tried to justify to Jerry Springer that it was okay for him to be marrying all of these women as teenagers, and Jerry just rips him a new one.
Interestingly enough, you always seem, and tell me if I'm wrong, but most of the wives that you have, you always married them when they were still children. You don't wait for a grown adult to come and say this is a great idea. You marry them when your other wife was 14 or 15 too, wasn't she? Mm-hmm. So you're always taking children. You know what? If I take a 14-year-old kid, I can convince that kid of anything and say, hey, you know what? If you get to see me once every 2 months, that's happiness. And if that's all the kid knows, the kid will believe that's happiness.
He also, in the late 90s, went on some of the other talk shows. He goes on Queen Latifah. He goes on Sally Jesse Raphael. I haven't actually seen any of these shows, but I assume the vibe is pretty similar. You've just got this fucking guy with his large family comprised of mothers that he married as children, trying somehow to justify his decision as acceptable to them, and just not really being accepted in any capacity. Which I'm probably making it sound like honestly way more ghoulish than it really is. I want to impart also that there was in many ways a sense of normalcy for the wives and children at Greenhaven, reportedly. They would watch movies like Braveheart, they would listen to Led Zeppelin, they didn't have any TV, they would listen to traditional Celtic music because the family was of Irish heritage and they were very proud of that. Like, there was a semblance of normalcy from what we can observe. It's just that the dynamic of what was happening within the family was so beyond the realm of normal and ethical when we consider consent and how consent is made. It's also worth noting that in 1999, the family was living off of $36,000 a year, which at the time is the equivalent of $62,000 a year. Which $62,000 a year nowadays, that's a pretty decent middle class income, especially if you're living somewhere rural and low level like the Green family was. for a family of like 4 or 5. But by this point, we have Tom, Linda, Shirley, Leanne, Carrie, and Hannah, and dozens of children. Imagine having dozens of people sharing $62,000 in today's money. So the family are also being supplemented by food stamps and Medicaid. So they're receiving assistance from the state as well. This is why I'm just thinking, like, why was he thinking that it was acceptable to publicly announce that he was doing extremely illegal things on TV? He's not keeping a low profile. I don't want to say this because it sounds like vaguely shitty and classist, but it's just the reality of things. If you're broke, people scrutinize you way more. They just do. I speak from experience. I think one of the reasons that, like, the Sister Wives family and the My Five Wives family, they were able to get away a little more with what they did because they were affluent. They were. Like, you had multiple families on those shows living really comfortable suburban lifestyles. I don't think that they would have been able to do that if they had been, you know, this fucking guy who occasionally telemarkets, and that's their income. Also in 1999, Tom and his wives would appear on a show that would completely change their lives. They went on Dateline, opened up their doors, showed around their home, described how they lived, but also on Dateline, they interviewed the county prosecutor named David Levitt. Now, David Levitt was the brother of, at the time, the governor of Utah. So David Levitt's going on this program, and he's basically saying, polygamy is illegal, and if it happens in my county, Juab County, I will prosecute it. All the while on that same episode, Tom Green and his wives are going, yeah, we are polygamous. Here we are, like, just straight up admitting to a crime on TV. What follows then is pretty predictable. Tom Green and David Levitt actually meet in person, and it's kind of awkward because David Levitt's basically like, hey, you're that fucking guy that said he was doing exactly the thing that I just told everyone I would prosecute for. We should talk. So actually, David Levitt and his wife go to Greenhaven and sit down with Tom and the Five Wives. And David Levitt says, I could prosecute you, but if I lose, it could get the laws against polygamy overturned. Tom's really not into that. He doesn't want to be prosecuted. He's like, I don't really want to do that, because I could go to jail if you win, and I'm really not into the idea of going to jail. Also, even if I win and I don't go to jail, it's still a huge pain in the ass, and I'm just trying to have my 5 wives and my dozens of children and try to support them and take care of them. So you should leave us alone. And David Levitt's basically like, no, I'm not gonna fucking leave you alone. You keep going on TV and telling the world that you're doing this illegal thing and making me look like an asshole. So 1999 keeps on going, and the family are a part of a documentary which, if you are in the know as far as polygamists on YouTube, you've probably seen it. It's called 1 Man, 6 Wives, and 29 Children. And it was a documentary produced by a British production company and shown overseas. At the time, actually, Tom was courting a 17-year-old girl named Candace McKinley, who herself was courting Tom's oldest son with Linda, Melvin, who by this point is 14 years old. So in this documentary, Tom is actually shown receiving summons papers to appear at Juab County because of what he's been doing. And by April 2000, Tom Green is formally charged with bigamy, criminal non-support, and child rape. Because if you remember, even though it is legal in Utah to have sex with a 14-year-old if that's your spouse legally, Linda wasn't 14, she was only 13. Which, can we just segue for a minute and talk about how fucked up it is that they have an age of consent, but it gets lower as long as you're married to them? That's not really an age of consent at that point. It's just an age of technicality. Like, oh yeah, 15, you can't consent to sex, but you can consent to marriage, which allows you to consent to sex. And it's not like Utah is the only state in the US that does this. If you're watching this from other countries, like, let this be an embarrassment upon us. Please, let this reflect upon our society. We have multiple states where you can have sex with children as long as you are married to them. So here's how the bigamy charges against Tom works, because at this point, he's not legally married to any of these women. He was legally married to them when they were under the age of consent to sex, and he needed to legally marry them in order for them to legally be able to consent to sex. Because that fucking makes sense. But by 2000, he's not legally married to any of these women. However, because Utah had a law against cohabitation and a common law marriage statute, it could have been legally argued that Tom was married to Linda. And it was legally argued that Tom was married to Linda. By July 2000, a judge ruled that Tom and Linda were legally married because of the common law marriage statute. Therefore, because Tom was also cohabitating with his other 4 wives, he was bigamizing because he was holding himself out as married to all of them. There was also some controversy surrounding his charge of child rape against Linda, which came about because he conceived Melvin with Linda when Linda was 13 and a half, remember? This was done in Mexico after Tom and Linda were legally married there. It was speculated that Utah, A, would not be able to prosecute Tom because of what had transpired down in Mexico, and B, because by this point, Melvin's like 15. The statute of limitations has run out. So by May 14th, 2001, his trial begins, and reporters from all over the world are watching this trial. Tom pleads not guilty to all of his charges, and by May 18th, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury finds Tom Green guilty of all of those charges. On August 24th of that year, Tom is sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay $78,000 of restitution back to the state for all the welfare benefits that they had been using while he was not paying child support on his family. Now, remember all that weird shit about the child rape charge? Well, January of 2002, a judge ruled that the statute of limitations had not run out, and Tom Green was ordered to stand trial on the child rape charge. Tom and his defense team are arguing that there could not be a child rape charge because all of that had went down in Mexico and it was legal down there. April 2002, the judge rules that he doesn't give a shit. By June 24th, 2002, Tom Green is found guilty on charges of child rape, facing 5 years to life for that charge. Spoiler alert, he only ended up serving 5 years, but he was forced to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life after his release. Now, obviously, the prosecution of a family's father is extremely devastating, no matter who that father was or what they was doing. It was completely devastating to the Green family that Tom was incarcerated. He had been the sole breadwinner for that family, and following his prosecution, his wives did have to find ways to earn an income. They continued to stay out at Greenhaven, and in 2003, they did their final interview on TV. They appeared on the program Mugshots to discuss the case, their life without Tom, and everything that had gone down. But I have to play you guys a clip from Mugshots because this is so absurd to me that this is even something that he could think he would be able to say on TV without someone questioning him. Now, I don't actually know what this is in reference to. I believe the interviewer must have asked if he would have done anything over differently, knowing now that he was in prison for how he conducted his family business. Tom had this to say.
Understanding things from a more contemporary societal perspective, I would have waited till, for sure, Linda was older.
And it's just so fucking smarmy to me that he would say something like that, understanding things from a more contemporary societal perspective. Because remember, he was not born into a fundamentalist Mormon church. He was born into a mainstream Mormon church. He had a contemporary societal perspective, and he chose not to act upon it. He was raised to understand not only that we are legally supposed to only have one spouse, which to me is neither here nor there. I don't really give a shit how many spouses you decide to have. That's none of my business. But when he says, I would have waited until for sure Linda was older, he grew up in mainstream society. He knew that being in his mid-30s and having a sexual relationship with a 13-year-old was frowned upon and unethical, and he did it anyway. Just the fact that he's trying to hide behind religion and culture as though, oh, I didn't know that it was so wrong because I'm a fundamentalist Mormon and in our culture it's not wrong. He wasn't a fundamentalist Mormon to begin with. He just fucking woke up one day and was like, hey, wait a minute, if I join this church, I can have a bunch of wives and they can be children. And in these interviews that he and his wives are doing on all these different shows, there's this recurring theme where they're like really defensive about the stereotype that Tom must just be doing this to have sex with them. And to dispel this, they just talk about how low Tom's sex drive is. Like, even Tom himself admits that his sex drive is low and his wives don't actually have sex with him that often. But that's the thing, it's not about sex. Sexual abuse is rarely about sex. It's about power. And the dynamic that Tom had created with these teenagers was one in which he was in a position of power and they were in a position of servitude to him. That's what's fucked up. That's what I have the problem with. That when adults are in a position of power over children and they abuse it by engaging in a sexual relationship with them, that's an abuse of power. And he's trying to insist that it's not an abuse of power because they were operating without a contemporary societal understanding. Man, fuck you. You know what I mean? Also, he knew what the fuck he was doing wrong. He knew how to skirt the law and get away with it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have married Linda, Leanne, and Hannah knowing that they were 14 and he could be prosecuted for having sex with them unless they were his spouse. Like, he wasn't an idiot. He was just a child molester. And he knew what he had to do in order to continue molesting these girls. So following the trial, the prosecution, the conviction, all of that, the wives continued living at Greenhaven and raising the children. Tom was set to be released in 2007. But in 2007, an interesting thing happens. Leanne actually leaves the marriage and files a protective order against Tom, stating that he must have supervised visitation with their children. She just leaves. At some point following his release also, Hannah left the marriage, leaving Tom married just to Linda, Shirley, and Carrie. One of the conditions of Tom's release actually was that he's not to do any more interviews in the media. He is to stay out of the public eye and shut the fuck up and not live with anybody but Linda. Tom, like I said, isn't an idiot, and he manages to skirt around this by Shirley and Carrie having separate houses from Linda. So by this point, he's not actually in violation of the law. He's not living with more than one woman. Legally, he's living with Linda. He's just staying with Shirley and Carrie also. It's hard to talk and count at the same time. So by the time Tom gets out, he, Linda, Shirley, and Carrie are living in South Jordan, Utah, which is a suburb of Salt Lake, and they have just a quiet life together. By this point, a lot of their children are adults. Leanne and Hannah have left the marriage and gone on to do other things. And Tom's legally not allowed to go on TV anymore, so they just stay in secrecy with the backdrop of their celebrity behind them. By February 28th, 2021, Tom Green, at the age of 72, actually passed away from complications of COVID-19. Per his obituary, he still was married to Linda, Shirley, and Carrie. He had 34 children, 54 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. I have to ask as well, and I'm going to put this in the description for anybody who doesn't make it this far, that Tom's wives and children are still alive and they have their own lives. I think it's important that we respect their privacy. Some people don't do that, and it's not fucking cool. Tom is right now at peace. He did time. He is legally and publicly recognized as a sex offender. At this point, everything that he's done is between him and his higher power. We can continue to comment about the case in hopes that people don't do what he did, but you know who shouldn't have to answer for his crimes? The young girls at the time who are now adult women who he victimized. You know who definitely shouldn't have to answer for his crimes? His children or grandchildren. Anybody else who is innocent. It's not their fault that Tom Green was who he was. But I know that since some documentaries about Tom Green continue to be really popular on YouTube, there are people who try to go after his survivors. That's not fucking cool. You accomplish nothing when you do that. So even though this is all public record, it's public knowledge, I'm going to leave all of my sources below as I do because this was a very public case, the family does deserve their privacy. We can talk about it while leaving them the fuck alone because they deserve to just go on about their lives. But yeah, that's the case of Tom Green, the original Sister Wives guy. Sometimes I wonder like how he must have thought about Sister Wives coming out in like 2010, so he's 3 years out of prison, and then all of a sudden this fucking guy comes and has a whole ass TV show about having multiple wives. I wonder if he was just sitting there like, are you fucking serious? Like, but again, the pivotal legal difference between Tom Green and Cody Brown is that Cody Brown's wives were adults. Like I said, that's what ultimately I have the problem with here. I'm very much the kind of person who's like, consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. It's debatable whether or not somebody can truly consent to an arrangement in which they don't have as much power, if that's the culture that they're brought into. It's also worth noting that of the 9 women Tom married in his life, 6 of them were under the age of 18, and 3 of them eventually left him, in 2 cases indicating that there was some type of abuse going on in the relationship. And it's really difficult to juxtapose those truths with, say, Linda, who from the time she was 17 until the time she was in her 30s made it very clear in all of these interviews, this is what I want to do. I wanted to grow up really fast, have a plural husband, have babies, and be a plural wife and mother. And that's exactly the narrative that she maintained throughout all of this. It sucks because while we need to have legal protections for girls to prevent them from being put in the situation she was in, it's also not fair to rob her of that narrative. It's so complicated. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me today. I have enjoyed almost finishing this scarf with you. By next week, it will be finished. I'm gonna finish it on my own time so that we can get started on our My Little Secret crop. Thank you for watching. Bye!